Hi. Hello, everyone. I'm Aitor Marcos. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability. I work with Joe Arby in his lab on environmental decision-making. And well, I'm a consumer researcher and ecological economist by training. My main research line is on investigating public perceptions on ecological limits of economic growth and how these are shaped by techno-optimism and politics. However, today I'm presenting a different topic, a research line that I'm starting to develop on climate activism. So I'm focusing on climate activism because in the recent years, especially since the pandemic, we've seen a new form of a more disruptive activism. Actually, when I arrived here on Saturday, I went to the Design Museum in Denmark, and I saw this exposition about how can activism be gentle. So we can see that it's a hot topic. Well, and we can ask why disruptive activism now? Why is taken up more and more often? Well, activists nowadays, in the face of the climate crisis, face a dilemma. It's called the activist dilemma. You can plan a moderate protest, being good and not making much noise, just showing up some banners, and that's it. But you run the risk of not making it to the news. But if you take the other approach, if your civil disobedience act is more disruptive, maybe you damage some private property, you will probably make it to the news, but you run the risk of public backlash. So we wanted to see how this activist dilemma played out in the US public. And we ran an experiment. But before that, very briefly, some theory about why we expect that disruptive activism it's not a good idea in the case of the US. And it's because some previous studies have shown in other contexts that disruptive protests lead to, well, those actions to be perceived as immoral actions. Then there's some sort of emotional disconnection or detachment from the protesters. And then people, the public in general, has a difficult time in seeing themselves identified with the protesters or with the activists. And that detachment from the activism is what ultimately leads to a decreased support or willingness to join the movement. This has been tested for hot topics in America, like abortion laws and gun laws. And we wanted to see if the same hold for climate activism, especially targeting companies. And here we had an idea, and it's, okay, here, what if we change the dependent variable? And instead of focusing on general support or willingness to join the movement, what if we focus on changes in customer loyalty? Because if these protesters are targeting some companies, like oil companies, for example, can we expect that maybe protesters cause a change in customer loyalty because these disruptive actions make public opinion more in favor or more against the companies? So we had that question in mind. And then we added a second question, which was, okay, but are all activist actions the same? Probably if you target an oil company, you will see a different reaction than if you target a bank that is funding oil exploration, for example. So before elaborating our hypothesis, we make two predictions. One, probably the changes we will see in customer loyalty will have to do with ascription of responsibility. That is that probably targeting a bank will be seen as more unfair because people will think that banks are not directly responsible for the climate crisis as opposed to the oil companies. No? So there will be a difference in ascription of responsibility. And also regarding the more positive effect of moderate protests, we have a balance theory here explaining that if you don't like activist actions, it's difficult to like their goals because you cannot like their actions if you don't like them, because here there's an imbalance and people strive to have a balanced attitudes in triadic relationships. So with all this in mind, we formulated 4 hypotheses. First, that probably in this specific case with the American public and with activists targeting companies, disruptive protests probably are less effective than moderate protests. And also that the effect of these protests depends on the kind of company that is being targeted, because targeting banks will be less effective than targeting oil companies, because the agency that banks have in the climate crisis probably is perceived as lower. And also, we predict a mediating relationship where the perceived agency then affects ascription of responsibility, and then ascription of responsibility affects intention to switch to another company. That's a proxy for customer loyalty. And so this is the model that we proposed and that we tested in a survey experiment. Any questions so far? Good. Okay, so we tested this model with a survey experiment. This was a study 1 of a larger study that we are planning. That's why the sample size is a bit small. We recruited 400 participants, and we ran a 2x2 experiment. So some people were exposed by to a news article in which they read about a moderate protest against an oil company, the same protest but against a bank, and then a disruptive protest against an oil company and a bank. So we created the tweets that people had to read in each manipulation. These were all taken from real cases, but we of course changed some names to make it anonymous. Then we measured some variables and created some scales. For example, for the perceived agency scale, we asked things like, this company is completely in control of everything that results from its new oil and gas investment projects. For ascription of responsibility, we asked things like, this company is jointly responsible for global warming. And then for intention to switch to another bank or energy supplier, we just asked them that if they found out that this company was being targeted by the protest, what would they consider choosing another company? So first, the overall result is that customer loyalty remains higher when the protests are. Oops, sorry, that's absent. I changed the. When the protests are extreme, the customer loyalty changes, decreases more, and what we find here is what we found was that the moderated mediation was significant, with protest extremity negatively affecting perceived agency positively affecting ascription of responsibility, and in turn, when participants were aware that had a clear idea that this company was responsible of the climate crisis, there was, of course, a positive relationship with intention to switch to another company. What was interesting was this moderating effect interacting here between protest extremity and perceived agency. And we can see it in this figure, because when the protests were moderate, the perception of companies' agency was the same, both for oil companies and for banks. But as protests were more disruptive, we can see a very significant difference, with the agency of oil companies being perceived as the same, but with the bank's agency being perceived as lower. So here, probably participants thought that it's unfair to target banks with disruptive protests, and probably that's why they perceived that the agency was lower. This, of course, was a small pilot study that we intend to expand with another conditions and measuring other things. We are planning a study too to make this more robust. And also, we can say that here is this is a clear limitation because it was a cross-sectional study, and some other study shows that the long-term effects of disruptive protests tend to dissipate over time. So very quickly, 4 conclusions. One, that if the goal is to influence customer loyalty, in some cases, moderate protests can be more effective than disruptive protests because of the activist dilemma. Then disruptive protests seem to have a negative effect on customer agency, on company agency, on perceived agency of the companies, but not in the case of oil companies, probably because it's too obvious and you cannot distract attention from that. And once the the perceived agency changes, it affects the ascription of responsibility, which in turn affects customer intentions to switch. And that's it. Thank you very much.